In the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, startling revelations are coming to light. The battlefield, once dominated by Russian forces, is now witnessing a dramatic shift. In the middle of winter, there has been a significant development within the Russian ranks. With victory seemingly out of reach, a growing number of Russian soldiers are desperately seeking escape routes. This has led to desertions and surrenders, especially in the southern military district of the Russian Federation, where desertions have escalated rapidly. So, how many soldiers have deserted in the southern military district? What were the reasons for their desertion? For answers to these questions and more, our video begins. With the end of the war or the prospect of being released from service not on the horizon, the number of Russian soldiers seeking a way out has risen sharply over the past few months. A database of soldiers suspended from service in the southern military district of the Russian Federation has been leaked online. The main document contains the names of 19,210 Russian servicemen who have been placed on the wanted list for desertion. These are mostly privates, but there are also corporals, sergeants, and some officers among the deserters. The document also includes additional spreadsheets with data on 685 people who had already been located. Two-thirds of the soldiers who left without permission or deserted in the southern military district were mobilized for the war against Ukraine. More than half of them belonged to the 1st and 2nd Army Corps, formed from the so-called People's Militias of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, DNR and LNR, which Russia controlled and formed in the Donbass territories it temporarily occupied in 2014. It's important to note that the figure of 19,210 soldiers on the wanted list does not reflect the actual number of deserters. This is because the database does not include soldiers who, for various reasons, were not listed as AWOL by the commanders of military units, who often limited their search to their own teams. So, we can conclude that the number of deserters is likely much higher. Mediazona, an independent Russian research organization in exile, reports about 7,400 AWOL cases in military courts since the start of mobilization. However, experts agree that this is just a small fraction of those trying to escape. This comes at a time when Russian authorities are making it increasingly difficult to avoid service. Last year, the maximum age for military service was raised from 27 to 30, increasing the potential pool of recruits to at least 700,000 by 2025. Russian soldiers often receive suspended sentences, allowing them to return to base, apologize, and be sent straight back to the front. The real number of AWOLs is probably much higher because very few commanders are willing to officially declare a subordinate AWOL. Commanders are reluctant to report desertions for fear of reprimand from their superiors. As a result, everyone tries to handle the situation themselves to avoid having a soldier's name officially entered into the system. Very few deserters from the Russian army have spoken to the news media. They know that Russians who speak out against President Vladimir Putin, both inside and outside the country, face grave consequences. Seemingly insignificant individuals are hunted down, harassed, and even thrown off balconies in Europe or the United States. Journalists and activists are poisoned, and many deserters cannot escape to safety. Without international passports, they are often stuck in countries that are part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, Russia's counterpart to NATO, where they still have easy access to the Kremlin. For these reasons, a vital gateway for defecting Russian soldiers is the I Want to Live surrender program run by the Ukrainian Armed Forces. According to Lieutenant General Jonathan Braga, commander of U.S. Army Special Operations Command, Ukraine's messaging efforts have been crucial in convincing thousands of Russian soldiers to leave their posts. Ukraine's information operations have helped remove 17,000 Russian soldiers from the battlefield without firing a shot. To protect these defectors from reprisals by Moscow, those who voluntarily surrendered through the I Want to Live app are recorded as captured in action, like all other prisoners of war. Ukrainian officials reported that 3 to 5 Russian soldiers surrendered every day under the I Want to Live program. The press service of the I Want to Live United Center for Accepting Russian Soldiers Surrender Applications stated that they received 40,157 requests through all channels, including Telegram, WhatsApp, chatbot, and hotline. The total number of deserters, those who do not want to fight, those who surrender, and those who leave the service without authorization is approaching 50,000. The Russian army has sent around 800,000 soldiers to the Ukrainian front. In other words, for every 15 soldiers the Russian army sends to Ukraine, 1 deserts or surrenders, and 10 are wounded or killed. This has been an incredibly unsuccessful campaign for the Russian military. The number of surrenders has increased at least 5-fold compared to the previous year. So far, around 40,000 to 50,000 Russian soldiers have either surrendered, applied for surrender to the Ukrainian army, or been taken prisoner. Analyzing the motivations of these deserters offers valuable insight into the profile of those attempting to escape. 36% of the applications were made by those who wanted to escape the Russian army, which points to a serious problem within Russia's military structure. Even more striking are the motivations of those who want to desert. 30% of the deserters were mobilized soldiers, which reflects the desperation of those who were quickly conscripted to maintain the war effort. 50% of the deserters were recruited and signed contracts after the start of the full-scale war. This represents a large proportion of those who, with the continuation of the war, realized the inevitable danger approaching and sought escape. 10% are soldiers with contracts signed before the war began. This reflects a process of taking precautions against the uncertainty of information, with the perception that war was imminent. The remaining 10% represent the rest of the deserters. The report explains the reasons for this increase. Soldiers have been held for almost a year and a half since the announcement of mobilization, without rotations, leading many to feel hopeless, which has contributed to the rising desertion rate. The soldiers involved in the project strongly criticized the treatment of Russian troops. Many realized that years of programmed propaganda portraying them as heroes fighting against fascists did not reflect the reality on the ground. Instead of fighting against fascists, these soldiers began questioning the real reasons for the war, feeling deceived by the narrative presented to them. Another important point emphasized in the report is the state of the soldiers' health. Most of those seeking to desert are reported to have illnesses that would disqualify them from military service. In other words, the lack of value placed on soldiers' lives and the inhumane treatment they experience are key issues within the Russian army. The Russian military is trying to find solutions to these problems, and desertions and surrenders to the enemy have become increasingly common. But what do we know about these desertions, surrenders, and casualties? The UK Ministry of Defence reported that Russia suffered 45,680 casualties in November alone. This was the highest number of casualties in any month since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, this figure is equivalent to more than 3 motorized rifle divisions of the Russian army. The latest estimates suggest that an average of 1,523 Russian soldiers are either killed or wounded every day. Russia lost more than 2,000 men in a single day on November 28. This represented a painful record for the Russian army. But the suffering for Russia did not stop there. The fierce fighting on the battlefield left deep scars not only on personnel but also on military equipment. In November, Ukrainian forces destroyed 307 Russian tanks, 899 armored combat vehicles, and 884 artillery pieces. According to Ukrainian Defense Ministry estimates, the value of the weapons and equipment lost by Russia in November exceeded $3 billion, surpassing the losses in September and October. UK Defence Minister Tony Radakin told a parliamentary hearing that Russia has lost almost half of its combat capability in Ukraine. According to Radakin, the Russian army fired 10 million artillery shells last year, but it can produce only 1 million shells per year. Additionally, Russia has lost 2,500 tanks, and it can only produce about 200 tanks annually. Radakin described the invasion of Ukraine as a catastrophic failure for Russia and praised the gains made by the Ukrainian army in its ongoing counteroffensive. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin also commented on the situation in Russia. Austin argued that Russia has suffered at least 700,000 casualties since February 2022 and has spent $200 billion since the start of the full-scale invasion. While casualty figures were already known, the $200 billion spent by the Russian military is a critical new data point that has come to light. But how is Vladimir Putin coping with the declining strength of his military? Right now, Russia's mobilization efforts and recruitment tactics suggest that the war in Ukraine is at a critical juncture. As of early October, the focus has been on how Putin manages his military forces without resorting to a full-scale mobilization that could provoke a backlash from the Russian people. While the 2022 mobilization wave shocked many Russians, Putin is now walking a fine line. He aims to maintain the flow of troops to the front lines while avoiding the political consequences of a public mobilization decree. His approach is multifaceted, involving everything from offering financial incentives to granting criminals immunity from prosecution if they agree to sign military contracts. The Russian government has become increasingly creative in its recruitment strategies. For example, advertisements promoting military contracts now permeate every aspect of daily life in Russia. From social media platforms to traditional media outlets, Russians are encouraged to enlist with promises of significant financial rewards. The ads offer lucrative signing bonuses, with reports suggesting that potential recruits are being offered one-off payments of up to 3 million rubles from federal, regional, and municipal funds. These payments are accompanied by other benefits, such as exemption from military service, loan forgiveness, and even mortgage holidays. It is clear that the Kremlin is doing everything it can to attract troops without resorting to a more formal call-up, which could lead to public unrest. Meanwhile, reports indicate that Russia's military commissions were already drawing up detailed lists and calculating reserves as early as September, making the necessary arrangements for a possible large-scale mobilization. While Putin has not yet implemented this plan, the administrative groundwork has already been laid. Some estimates suggest that the Kremlin is preparing to mobilize between 500,000 and 850,000 troops. However, the actual number of troops deployed to the front line is likely to be lower, as many will remain in training centers or reserves. Still, the scale of this mobilization effort cannot be underestimated. Despite the Kremlin's best efforts to keep the war out of sight for most Russians, there is a growing sense of apathy and disconnection from the conflict. For many, the war has become a distant issue, something happening far away, while everyday life in the major cities continues relatively unaffected. The Kremlin has worked hard to shape the narrative that war is a necessary evil to protect Russia from external threats, while making it seem like something that doesn't truly affect the average person. However, this illusion may not last forever. If Putin is forced to order a full-scale mobilization, the reality of the war will hit the lives of many Russians who have so far managed to avoid its direct consequences. There are signs that the Russian army is struggling to meet its ambitious recruitment targets. As intense fighting continues, the Russian military needs at least 400,000 new recruits a year to maintain current force levels. However, actual recruitment numbers are falling far short of this target. As the war drags on, there are signs that this system of governance is nearing its breaking point. Reports suggest that Putin has become increasingly paranoid about his own security, demolishing his residence in Sochi for fear of a possible drone attack. While some speculate that Putin is simply upgrading his residence, the reality is that the Russian president is becoming more isolated and distrustful of those around him. This isolation has been worsened by the war, which has forced Putin to constantly balance the demands of his military commanders, the needs of his political allies, and the discontent of the Russian people. While Putin continues to project confidence, there are growing concerns that the war could eventually lead to a leadership crisis in Russia. The question is not whether Putin will win the war, but whether he can maintain control of the country long enough to claim victory. Despite these challenges, Putin is determined to continue the war. So how might the war shape up in 2025 under these conditions? While Russian President Vladimir Putin was holding his carefully staged annual phone call and press conference to answer questions from journalists and ordinary Russians, EU leaders were hosting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Brussels for their final meeting of the year. Unsurprisingly, the war in Ukraine occupied a large place at both events. But the conflict in Ukraine is just one part of a complex and rapidly changing geopolitical environment that neither Russia nor the EU, nor even Ukraine can fully control. The main reason for this is Donald Trump, who will return to the White House at the end of January 2025. Trump already has a huge influence on the calculations made by Moscow and Brussels. His determined effort to end the war in Ukraine is viewed with suspicion on the other side of the Atlantic. This is as true for Brussels as it is for Moscow. On December 16, European foreign ministers reiterated their determination to support Kyiv, no matter what. Former Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas was clear when she stated that European military support should be stepped up. The key was to ensure that Ukraine not only holds on but also tips the scales in their favor, as they will not stop unless Putin is stopped. In another sign that the EU is hardening rather than softening its stance against Russia, foreign ministers adopted the bloc's 15th sanctions package. This is one of the most significant sanctions packages to date, targeting 54 individuals and 30 organizations, and blacklisting an additional 32 companies for circumventing existing sanctions. On December 18, Zelensky met with another negotiating skeptic, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Rutte's remarks echoed those of the new president of the European Council, Antonio Costa, who similarly stated that the EU should stand by Ukraine for as long as necessary and do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia's invasion is defeated and international law prevails. Meanwhile, Putin, in his annual phone call, made his usual bluffs, claiming that Russia had won in Ukraine, in an event he continues to call a special military operation. The main purpose of this event is to reassure ordinary Russians that things are largely on track to achieve Russia's war aims. The irony that this is the third consecutive event after 2023 and 2022, in which Putin praised Russia's superiority and imminent victory, seems to have been lost on both the president and his audience. The message that the Kremlin is seeking a military victory and is confident that it can achieve it was further emphasized at a meeting of the Russian Defense Ministerial Board on December 16. Here, Putin outlined the need to continue investing in the country's armed forces, which has now reached 6.3% of GDP. He was also clear in reiterating that the state and the Russian people are giving the armed forces everything they can to fulfill the tasks set for them, while sounding a note of caution that the Kremlin cannot increase this spending indefinitely. According to Putin, these tasks include defeating the neo-Nazi regime in Kyiv that allegedly seized power in 2014 and expelling the enemy from Russian territory. At least in their public statements, the leaders of Moscow and Brussels seem strangely united in their determination to continue the fight, regardless of what kind of deal Trump might propose. For Putin, the rationale for doing so is that he clearly believes he is gaining military momentum. His forces made daily gains of about 30 square kilometers on Ukrainian territory in November alone. Western authorization to attack targets deep inside Russia has so far had little effect. Meanwhile, Russia's recent airstrikes against Ukraine's critical national infrastructure have caused unprecedented damage. For the EU, the logic is different. EU leaders fear abandonment under Trump and have yet to agree on credible security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire or even a full peace settlement. The overriding concern preoccupying the minds of European leaders is the possibility that Putin will use a mere pause in the conflict to regroup and rearm, and then pose an even greater threat to European security in the future. It is hoped that supporting Ukraine to continue defending itself against Russian aggression will allow EU and European NATO members to avoid the existential struggle Ukraine has faced since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. All this leaves Ukraine significantly vulnerable. There will also be political pressure from Ukraine's European allies to continue a struggle that Europe is desperate to avoid. As we move towards 2025 and Trump 2.0, this leaves Zelensky with few good options and few reliable allies. The best Ukraine can hope for is to buy time. Zelensky will need to appease Trump. He will need to be open to the idea of negotiating with Russia while preventing the front lines from collapsing before a ceasefire is reached. In the meantime, if Europe gets serious about its own defense, this could eventually lead to the EU and Kyiv's European NATO allies standing on their own 2 feet and providing the continent and Ukraine with a credible deterrent against Russia. So far, they have spoken. In 2025, they will have to prove that they can stand behind what they have promised. Thank you for tuning in.